Hey YouTube, Jesse here with Choctaw Clover. This video is going to be a departure from my normal beadwork videos. I'm going to be reading a chapter from a book called The Wild Trees by Richard Preston. It's a description of a redwood treetop and the canopies. So if this isn't your thing, feel free to skip this video and then just to come back around for the next beadwork tutorial or thing that I put out. So I'm just going to be reading this chapter from this book because I just really wanted I really want to share it with you guys. So to set the scene, it takes place it's like the late 80s, early 90s. Two brothers and their friends go to the Redwoods in Northern California, and they're trying to find like wild trees, like the wilderness, not staying in a campground, just in the woods. And this is where one of the brothers has climbed a smaller tree in order to get up into the canopy of a redwood giant. As Steve Sillett leapt out of the small tree, its top sprang upward. He felt gravity go to zero, and everything seemed to slow down. Feeling alert and calm, he watched the branch of the large redwood approach with drawn-out and perceivable slowness. The branch came into his hands. He closed his fingers around it. There was a jerk. He found himself hanging from the branch by both hands, bouncing, with his feet kicking around in the air. He immediately began to travel along the branch, going hand over hand as he hung from it and trying to get himself over to the trunk. It wasn't a difficult move, it was just a monkey hang. Any kid could do it on a jungle gym. He didn't dare look down. He got himself over the trunk, and then he snapped his body upward and got one foot on the branch, and in one fluid movement he stood up on the branch, grabbed another branch above him and swung up to it, and stood balancing, motionless. "It's doable," he said to Marwood. He was surprised at what had just happened, and his thoughts went, "We're primates, and those opposable thumbs are awesome." Marwood climbed into position and got ready. He thought, well, if Steve can do it. He actually felt fairly confident that he could pull off the move. It was just that there was no safety rope to stop his fall if he made an error. Blow the move and lose your life. He got himself into focus and jumped. The next thing Steve knew, Marwood was hanging by his hands from the lowest branch of Nameless and screaming. The branch was shaking, and Marwood was writhing underneath it. He looked as if he were getting electric shocks. "Shit, there's bees!" he screamed. He was surrounded by darting yellow-jacket wasps. Marwood traveled hand over hand in a monkey hang while the wasps stung him on his neck and hands. For one bad moment, Steve thought that Marwood might get stung in the eyes and would let go of the branch and fall to his death, but Marwood wasn't about to let go no matter what. He got over to the trunk, got his feet planted in the bark, and hauled himself up onto the branch and stood on it, swearing loudly. Holding onto the bark with one hand, balancing himself on the branch, he swatted at the yellow jackets off his face and neck, and then, still cursing, he began to climb upward at remarkable speed. The approach of Marwood Harris and a swarm of wasps encouraged Steve Sillett to keep climbing higher. He went from branch to branch. Marwood followed below him. The yellow jackets faded away. Farther up the trunk, Steve arrived at a blank zone where there were no branches. He couldn't see any way to climb higher. Above him, extending 12 feet, was an empty, grooved surface of bark. At the top of the stretch of empty trunk, there was a strong-looking branch. He looked down. Mistake. He was 90 feet up. The fear of heights came over him in a sickening wave, worse than before. "What am I doing here?" he thought. "I'm going to die." He began to climb upward along the surface of the bark, Spider-Man style, jamming his hands and feet into cracks in the bark. The climbing tactic is known to rock climbers as crack jamming or crack climbing. To perform a crack climbing move, you jam a hand or foot into a crack, get it stuck there, and then put your weight on the stuck part of your body and lunge upward with one hand, jamming it into a crack that's higher up. With a series of climbing moves, Steve climbed up the 12 feet of sheer redwood bark. He managed to get to the next branch. He grabbed it, swung himself up onto the branch, and stood on it. He was somewhere in the lower tiers of Nameless, in the patchy zone of epicormic branches, where sprays of epi branches grow like fuzz on a redwood's trunk. He badgered Marwood, telling him it was easy, dude, and that he should have no problem getting up the 12 feet of bare bark. They both ended up standing on a big branch at around 120 feet above the ground. They had arrived at the base of the crown of Nameless. In its first 20 years of life, a coast redwood can grow from a seed into a tree that's 50 feet tall. In the next 1,000 years, it grows faster, adding mass at an accelerating rate. A redwood can go from a seed to a big tree in about 600 years. Around age 800, which is the end of its youth, it may reach its maximum height, its 30-something story height. Redwoods are extremely shade tolerant. They can survive in dark places, at the bottom of a forest, in the deep shade of their elders, where few other trees would survive. A small redwood living in deep shade hardly grows at all, but it doesn't die. It goes into a kind of suspended animation. If it gets hit by light, it grows with relentless speed. As a redwood enters middle age, it typically loses its leader. The top spire dies back. I suppose this is a little like a man going bald. The top spire turns into a bleached skeleton, and it falls off the tree. The bark of a redwood is usually a reddish-brown color, but as some redwoods get old, their bark can turn stony gray. Even when the top falls off and its bark turns gray, a redwood is still growing, and in fact, may have hardly begun to grow. In this respect, it is not like a person at all. A redwood reacts to the loss of its top by sending out new trunks. The new trunks appear in the crown, high in the tree, and they point at the sky like fingers on an upraised hand. The new trunks grow straight up from the larger limbs, rising vertically and traveling parallel to the main trunk. As the new trunks rise and extend themselves over centuries, they send out branches. These branches eventually spit out yet more trunks, and those trunks grow branches that send up more trunks, and so on. The tree is becoming a grove of redwoods in the air, containing redwoods of all sizes, from tiny to large. This aerial grove is connected to the ground through one main trunk. The whole structure is, of course, a single living thing. With the passing of centuries, the extra trunks begin to touch one another here and there. The trunks and branches of a redwood can fuse and flow together like silly putty melting into itself. The bases of the extra trunks bloat out and become gnarled masses called buttresses. In the crowns of the largest redwoods, bridges of living redwood are flung horizontally from trunk to trunk and from limb to limb. This cross links the crown and strengthens it, in much the same way the flying buttresses support the structure of a cathedral. As a redwood gets very old, its crown spreads out until it can look like a thunderhead coming to a boil. Every 500 years or so, a redwood may burn in a huge fire. There may be blackened chambers, holes, and rooms in the tree. These are fire caves. After it's been burned in a fire, even riddled with fire caves, a redwood can grow back. It drops off the charred buttresses and burned trunks, or sends living wood flowing up around them, and continues to send out new trunks until the tree has become a three-dimensional maze in the air with a complexity that comes close to defeating the human's mind ability to understand it. But the measure of overall size, the volume of wood, the largest species of living tree on Earth is not the coast redwood, but the giant sequoia, a type of cypress that is closely related to the coast redwood. The giant sequoia occurs in the 67 small spots on the western slopes of the Sierra Nevada mountains in California. The species name of the tree is Sequoiadendron giganteum. The giant sequoia thrives in sunshine, and it gets moisture from melting snow. Giant sequoias, mountain trees, and coast redwoods, coastal fogbelt trees, are never found in the same forest. The giant sequoia trees typically have thicker and more massive trunks than the existing coast redwoods, but they aren't as tall as the coast redwoods. At present, the world's largest living thing is a giant sequoia named the General Sherman. The General Sherman tree grows in Sequoia National Park in the southern Sierra Nevada and is a tourist attraction. The General Sherman is 27 feet in diameter at breast height. Breast height, 4.5 feet above the ground, is the height at which tree experts measure the diameter of a trunk when they're calculating the size of a tree. The General Sherman is 275 feet tall. It is a very tall tree. Even so, the General Sherman is more than 100 feet shorter than the tallest coast redwood. It contains around 55,000 cubic feet of wood. If the General Sherman were to be cut into foot-wide planks an inch thick, the planks were laid end to end, they would stretch for 125 miles. Until recently, the coast redwood seems to have been not only the tallest, but also the largest tree on Earth, actually bigger than the Giant Sequoia. The largest redwoods were cut down in logging operations during the 20th century. One of the larger redwoods was a Crandall Giant, which was felled in 1926 along the Little River in Humboldt County. Records made when the Crandall Giant was cut up into cylinders show that it contained at least 65 to 70,000 cubic feet of wood. It was a lot bigger than the General Sherman, and it was a lot taller, too. The coast redwood trees seem to be the largest and tallest individual living organisms that has appeared in nature since the beginning of life on this planet. There is something much bigger than a redwood, but it may be strictly considered an individual. It is an edible fungus called the honey mushroom, or Amarularia, and the largest one of those seems to have been discovered so far is a mass that lives mostly underground, putting up individual mushrooms here and there. The whole mass occupies a little over 3 square miles in the Blue Mountains in northeastern Oregon. Steve Sillett and Marwood Harris began to penetrate the crown of Nameless. The branches were bigger and closer together, and there was foliage everywhere, above, below, and on all sides. At this point, they lost sight of the ground. They felt as if they were passing through the membrane and entering another world. Below them, they could see nothing but opaque masses of greenery. Above them, there was no sky, nothing but layer upon layer of foliage, like tents within tents. They had entered the deep redwood canopy. The tree hadn't looked so big from the ground. Marwood could see Steve's sky-blue bandana bobbing and weaving above the branches overhead. Steve was such a graceful climber, Marwood thought, yet there were things about Steve Sillett that annoyed him. He worked out in the gym constantly, and Marwood thought he was a little narcissistic. He was incredibly good-looking, but he seemed to have no understanding of women, and he was barely removed from virginity. He complained endlessly to Marwood about how he couldn't find a girlfriend. His idea of making himself attractive to a woman was to lose his shirt. The shirt would come off, revealing a body that was like the statue of Apollo, and then he would start talking obsessively about moss and seed pods, things like that. It wasn't completely effective. Of course, he was still a teenager, a year younger than most college juniors, because he had skipped a year of high school. Reed College was an intense place, with high academic standards. It was clear that Steve was under a lot of pressure. To help blow off some of the pressure, Steve had started climbing trees on campus. Marwood and a few other friends had gotten into the habit of following him up into the trees, and they would chill in the treetops and talk, or take books with him and study. If it wasn't for climbing trees and playing Dungeons and Dragons, I don't know how I could survive college, Steve said to Marwood one day. Steve Sillett was a science geek, trapped inside the body of an Olympic athlete. Steve was climbing 20 feet above Marwood, and he was concentrating on movement, keeping himself focused so that he wouldn't fall. At the same time, his senses were being almost overwhelmed by an impression of life all around. The crown of Nameless was loaded with clumps of ferns. The ferns were growing on the branches and down in the crotches, where limb systems came together or where they grew out of limbs. There were hanging gardens of ferns and other plants. These plants of the air, he realized, had to be rooted in something. He looked more closely. They were rooted in pockets of dirt. How had the dirt gotten up here, he wondered. He noticed that the branches of Nameless got larger and thicker higher up in the trunk of the tree, farther away from the ground. This redwood structure is the opposite of most trees, in which the branches get smaller and higher up in the air. But the redwood forest grew increasingly complicated and more massive higher off the ground. He could only wonder how old the limbs were. If the tree were more than 1,000 years old, then some of the larger limbs he was climbing on could have existed at the time of Columbus's discovery of the New World. There were lacy things everywhere, flaky, gray-green, and brownish things, sort of like plants. They were lichens. Poe had taught Steve about lichens. Lichens are small organisms that often grow on bark and on rocks. A lichen, sounds like lichen, is a fungus growing in association with a species of algae or cyanobacterium, forming a single combined organism. Algae use chlorophyll to get energy from sunlight, as plants do, during photosynthesis. Cyanobacteria also collect light and perform photosynthesis. In a lichen, the fungus part of the organism is like a landlord who builds a house, and the algae, or cyanobacterium, is the tenant who pays rent to the landlord. The landlord uses the rent to build a larger house for more tenants. Steve had been interested in lichens since childhood. He found a kind of lichen growing on Nameless that Poe had shown him as a boy when they were out catching toads or snakes near her cabin. It was a British soldier lichen, which forms little stalks with red caps on them, supposedly like British soldiers. Poe had taught him its Latin name, Cladonia, saying it in her smoke-wrecked voice. There were many other kinds of lichen in the tree, in all manner of shapes. Drippy, frizzy, frilly, powdery, crusty, stringy, and hairy lichens. He began picking pieces of lichen off the branches and tucking them into his shirt pockets. There were mosses everywhere, as well of different shapes and shades of green, and there were other kinds of plants growing on Nameless too. A plant that grows on another plant is called an epiphyte. An epiphyte is an aerial plant and typically grows on the branches of a tree. It does not have its roots in the ground. Epiphytes feed on the moisture and nutrients in trees. Steve felt as if he had gone inside the body of a living organism, with uncounted other organisms living inside it. The fear of heights finally left him and was replaced by a feeling of almost indescribable wonder. At the time that Steve Sillett and Marwood Harris made the first ascent of Nameless, there was a general belief among biologists that the redwood forest canopy was what they called a redwood desert. That is, the redwood canopy was believed to be essentially empty of life other than the branches of redwood trees. In any case, biologists regarded coast redwood trees as unreachable towers, remote and bare. Steve Sillett encountered something quite different. He found what amounted to coral reefs in the air. Moving upward steadily through the labyrinth, Steve and Marwood reached the top of the Nameless an hour after they had jumped into it. As they neared the upper surface of the redwood canopy, they saw that sunlight was shining through a Gothic lacework of branches, illuminating masses of plants, which glowed with varied shades of green. Steve, leading the climb, broke out and into a lost glade in the sky. The top of Nameless had been sheared away in a storm that occurred many centuries earlier, and the tree had reacted by driving a radiance of branches spreading horizontally in all directions away from the broken trunk, like spokes coming out of the hub of a wagon wheel. Those branches had sprouted, vertical trunks, like spikes on a crown. A forest of small redwoods had sprung out of the top of Nameless Wood. In the center of Nameless Wood, there was a big rotting stump, several feet across. It was the broken-off main top of the tree. Billows of huckleberry bushes grew out of the stump in beach-ball-sized puffs, and they were full of ripe huckleberries. Steve sat down behind a huckleberry bush. He couldn't believe what he was seeing. It was sunny at the top of the tree, warm and autumnal. He began plucking and eating the huckleberries. They were sweet and slightly tart, and they dripped with juice. There were damp spots in the top of Nameless. It was as if there were tiny springs in Nameless Wood, and the huckleberry bushes were sending roots down into the moisture. Marwood Harris's appeared through a gap in the platform of branches. He looked around. "Holy shit," he said. The branches and trunks of Nameless Wood grew so close together that Steve and Marwood could climb around on them as if they were climbing a jungle gym without fear of falling. Marwood explored the top of Nameless, and then he sat down on a branch beside Steve and stretched out, warming his body in the sunlight. The spiritual weight of the place seemed immense. It was as if he were waking up from a sleep, as if his life up until then had been a dream, and this was real. He felt as if he had left time behind. He felt as if they were leaving Marwood Harris behind too. What seemed real to him was the trees. The redwoods were overwhelming with their reality. He could see nothing except the California coast ranges, running off into the north, south, and east, ridges and canyons blanketed with redwoods, and then the Pacific Ocean, stretching westward into the infinities of blue. Redwoods and the sea. They spent a long time resting on the top of Nameless, saying little to each other. They had discovered a lost world above California, and it was unexplored. The sun began to drop down over the ocean, and the sky deepened in color. What was dismaying was that they were only halfway through the climb. They still had to get down, and this was the part that really frightened Marwood Harris. Climbing down is scarier than climbing up. They began to descend very slowly. As they went down, they came to places where they had to hang from the branch by their hands and let go, drop through the air down to the next branch, and then grab for dear life when they landed on it. More than once, they nearly slipped to their deaths. And then they had to make the leap back across the terrifying gap into the small redwood. The wasps were stirred up and attacked them again. Eventually Scott Skillet heard the voices in the little redwood, and they made it to the ground. Their faces were blotchy with stings, but they were alive. That night, the three young men pitched their tents in a redwood grove not far from the sea. They ate canned spaghetti for dinner. As they listened to Steve talk about the climb, Scott began to worry about his brother. Steve was restless, like their father, and he was driven by passions that caused him to risk his life. Scott could see the beginning of a story involving his brother, but he couldn't see the end. The question to Scott was whether his brother would survive.